Cornish Saints and Sinners by J. Henry Harris.
Chapter 17. Cornish humour has its practical side with a tang. The curing your old cow till she died is native. A candidate for parliamentary honours once sent the freeman of the borough a silver teapot as a prize to be sailed for at the forthcoming regatta. The freeman returned it with the remark that the teapot do not draw well enough. The teapot came back again, filled with golden guineas, which so improved its drawing powers that the freeman kept it. A Cornishman likes a story about someone who comes out on top by a trick, or one which hides his meaning by a play of words, until the situation is revealed in a flash. We picked up a few specimens. As deep as old Hugh. Two brothers went a-fishing, and one was a scholar with a reputation beyond his attainments, which, in fact, were limited to reading and writing, after a fashion, and reckoning with his head. The other was a man of simple and trustful nature, and was often puzzled, but let things go without inquiring deeply into them. The scholar was called Hugh, and as he managed to come out on top on most occasions, he was considered both cunning and wise, and people encouraged their children to cram themselves with book learning in order to become as deep as old Hugh. And deep as old Hugh became a proverb which he locally shared with old Nick, who, up to this time, had the monopoly. The simple brother was Dick. Hugh and Dick were partners in a small boat and nets, and earned a poor living by their trammels and drag nets and crab pots. What they caught, they equally divided, but Hugh always had the best half, which puzzled Dick. But scratch his head as he might, he could never get to the bottom of the mystery, everything being so fair and above board and done in the light of day. One day they were out and caught 6 mackerel and 6 scads. Now scads are of small value, and yet Dick got them all, and Hugh all the mackerel. Hugh did the sharing. "Here's a mackerel for me, and a scad for you," said he, making a division. "And a scad for you, and a mackerel for me, and a mackerel for me, and a scad for you." And so on until all the scads fell to Dick, and all the mackerel to himself. Hugh's system was perfect, and if it could be adapted, might be depended on to break the bank of Monte Carlo every night. "How is it that I've got all the scads?" asked Dick. "It's all right," replied Hugh pleasantly, "and if you don't think so, I'll do it over again. Here's a mackerel for me, and a scad for you, and a scad for you, and a mackerel for me," and so on to the end, until Dick got all the scads as before. "He would have settled the fiscal question in no time," said Guy. "A mackerel for me and a scad for you. A fair motto for protectionists." The game was played in the Far East with the Mikado, but the Tsar got the scads. It's safest played with the blind. The man who slept with a badger. Guy wanted something done to a shoe, and walked into a room where a man was sitting, waxing a long thread and whistling to the thrushes and blackbirds hung around in cages. The fellow was most obliging. Guy told us, and put aside the work he was doing, and asked several questions about himself, where he came from, where he was going, how long he intended to stay, and whether his father and mother were living. Then the cobbler told him about himself, and how many of the Tremaines, he being called Reuben Tremaine, lay in the parish churchyard. All this time Guy's shoe rested on his apron. Just a few stitches were all that was wanted, and Mr. Tremaine got in one when he started talking of London. What a brave place it must be, and what a pure few people it contained, all being true that he had heard. Guy forgot about his shoe and gave an entertaining sketch of a London crowd in Fleet Street on Lord Mayor's Day, and the Lord Mayor's show was described in his best style. And then the Crystal Palace on a fete day, and on a Handel festival day, and the Houses of Parliament and Madame Tussauds. Guy made the Arabian Nights entertainments look small, and he began to fear that Reuben Tremaine would be paralyzed with admiration and unable to put in another stitch. All the morning was gone, and Guy still sat on a low three-legged stool with one shoe off, as happy as any Lord Chancellor on the woolsack. He really was enjoying himself with the simple Reuben. "Did he ever hear tell of a man up to London who slept with a badger?" asked the cobbler, at length piercing the shoe with his awl for another stitch. "A real live badger?" "Yes, sure, live enough." "Never," said Guy, turning up his nose. "Why, a badger?" And he put his thumb and finger to his nostrils with a sign which meant more than words. "I know a man," said the cobbler confidently, "who have slept with a badger for 10 year. Come next Michaelmas Fair Goose Day, and he got so accustomed to it that he couldn't sleep apart. Would he like to see the badger?" "Very much." "And the man?" "Oh, certainly, one of nature's freaks." "Two of 'em," said Reuben solemnly, putting in the last stitch and handing the shoe to Guy. "You'd like to see what's to be seen, s'pose?" The cobbler whistled shrilly whilst untying his apron, and a woman with dark hazel eyes and a face aquiline and refined appeared. Guy made his best bow. "The gentleman do want to see the badger that the man slept with," said Reuben slowly. "And the man, I should like to see the man who had such extraordinary taste," added Guy, saying something just to enable him to look at the woman without being rude. The woman reddened, and her eyes sparkled. "Tell him, me dear, what name you owned, to avoid you was married," said the cobbler. "Badger, and too good for you," replied the lady. "That's the badger, and this is the man," said the cobbler with a smile. Guy was very cross when he told the story, only to think that he had painted London town and London wit in such colours, and then to be dropped on by a simple cobbler before a handsome woman. But he wasn't cross long, and he went out and bought a pretty chain and gave it to the cobbler to lead his badger with. So Guy and the cobbler cried quits. The parson trumps. To be able to do a clane of trick is to be the hero in a parish for generations, and Parson Arscott was quoted at all the fairs as a masterpiece for doing the thing clane off at a horse deal. The story goes that the reverend gentleman attended Summercourt Fair, which is famed throughout the land. If you can't get what you want at Summercourt Fair, you must be hard to please, for the lame and the blind are there, the young and the aged, the sound and unsound, and you buy on your own judgment and without warranty. Parson Arscott knew a good horse when he saw it, and went early and looked about him. In the thick of the fair the parson went and examined the horses' tails, and so attracted attention to himself, for everyone knows that to tell a horse's age you must open its mouth and look at its teeth. And the curious part of the business was that the person knew as much about the animal he was handling by lifting its tail as other people did by opening its mouth. At length Parson came to a nice little cob that suited him, and the deal began. It was a weary deal, but Parson was firm. "I've looked at his tail, and I know he's rising 5, said he, and he was right. Whatever the parson said about the cob was right, and yet he never once looked at its mouth. There was a trifle of £5 between them when the shades of evening began to fall, and no hope of any advance on the part of the parson. At last the dealer said, "Tell me how you know a horse's age by his tail, and you shall have the cob." The parson counted down the guineas and whispered, "I looked into his mouth beforehand." Parson Ascot's deal makes a horse dealer shiver to this day. The parson knew Kurt. But sharp as the parson was at the fair, he was no match for a woman on her own ground. Parson was round, collecting his tithes, and came to a farm whereupon the farmer's wife presented her husband with a 10th child, and an old sow littered 10 years. Parson is out in the town place, and is come for the pig. Which shall us give him? Asked the farmer of his better half, sitting in the kitchen suckling her baby. Tiv pig, is it? What next, I wonder? I'll tiv piggin, says Mrs. Farmer, rising and taking the infant with her. The parson was very polite, of course, to Mrs. Farmer and number 10, and asked about the christening. That's for you to say, parson, says the lady holding out number 10. He do belong to you. The parson flushed. This was not in his line. It's sure he do, 'tis teething child, and now you taken. Farmer made his appearance with the weakliest of the 10 years squealing in his arms, and the parson made towards him. But the woman was equal to the occasion and stood between them shouting, "No child, no veer!" And that time she had her way and saved the little pig. So there arose a saying in the parish that a parson might cheat the devil, but a woman could cheat a parson. "Every one to his trade," said Guy. To be sure for sartin is an averment of absolute knowledge, but a Cornishman is not often willing to speak to anything in so pronounced a fashion. To be sure as can be admits of a loophole and many explanations in the event of error. Something non-committal in the shape of speech suits him best. Things of no consequence become mysterious when screened with secrecy. An ordinary conversation is like this. "Where are you going?" "Down along." "Where to?" "Past the corner." "How far?" "A pure bit." "Will you be long?" "Maybe. Say an hour?" "If you like." "Or two?" "Shouldn't wonder." And so on, until the questioner is tired of asking further questions. The people don't notice anything peculiar about this want of directness in reply to the simplest questions. To tell the truth, and yet to mislead, is looked on as an accomplishment, which may be turned to profit without scandal, as by the man who sold a blind horse as free from vice. "To be blind is a misfortune and not a vice," replied the seller, when charged with deceit. Cornish diamonds are hard to beat on a deal. We chanced upon a couple one market day, chaffering about a pig in a tap room. 20 score weight and 5 pence a pound?" 4 pence halfpenny, and I'll take the head and all of 'em. And barley 18 shillings a bushel, I'll see to it. 1 hour already by the clock had been consumed by the little farmer who had a pig to sell, and the little pork butcher who wanted to buy one, and there was this halfpenny between them. Friendly customers chaffed a bit and threw in a word between drinks, and it seemed that the jobber who could keep a stiff upper lip and his temper longest would come out on top. The unfortunate pig was haggled over with and without the hams, with and without the bacon fat, with one ham only, with its head without its head, with only half its head, and every cunning offer of the little pork butcher was resisted with a fineness of perception, of self-interest, that would have done credit to the peace plenipotentiaries at Portsmouth. Another hour passed, and the butcher advanced 1 farthing. 4 pence 3 farthings, but without the head. And then there was the luck penny. At last the whole carcass was sold, head and all, at 4 pence 3 farthings, and the lucky penny was spent out. It was a hard deal, and neither seemed too well pleased. Only the customers all said it was a fair bargain, and seemed pleased when the men shook hands over it. Chapter 18. Life on a farm by the roar of the sea approaches the ideal upon earth. It isn't quite the ideal, because the ideal is always round the corner, but it is near it, and that is something to be thankful for. Mrs. Andrew Warfer ran the farm, and she had 2 tall, strapping sons and a daughter. Mrs. Andrew Warfer was what is called a comfortable woman, and comfort is the one virtue prized above rubies in these parts. It was through accident that we struck the farm one afternoon, the fact being that the Bookworm was limping, having slightly sprained his ankle. There wasn't much to recommend us at first sight. 3 dusty wayfarers with small knapsacks and no warts or other indications of royal lineage upon either of us. The farmhouse was situated in an old-fashioned garden, and a good roomy porch with seats on either side offered hospitality. Open windows were visible through luxuriant fuchsias and creepers, but what the walls were built of no one could tell, so completely covered were they with flowering plants. It was a sort of place which wanted to be looked at again and again, something fresh coming into view each time, and the oftener you looked at it, the more you liked it. The Bookworm rapped modestly with his knuckles upon the thick door, but no one came. We could hear voices, and an aromatic perfume filled the passage. The Bookworm tried again and only hurt his knuckles. Then Guy said he'd negotiate, and if he got into trouble we were there to help him. The smell of burning furze and brambles guided him to the great kitchen, and he winked again and coughed as the smoke from the wide open fireplace filled his eyes. There was a little maid heaping up the thorns and brambles, and somewhere in the blue haze he saw the supple outline of a young girl with her arms bare. They were heating the brick oven for bread baking. A very sweet voice floated through the film of blue, aromatic smoke. A sudden draught cleared the smoke, and Guy stood face to face with the owner of the voice. And a nice face it was, now radiant with the heat from the burning brambles. The bare arms were dimpled, and the whole figure was cased in a white wrapper, showing to perfection the clear skin and brown hair and light hazel eyes of the young girl. This was Miss Andrew Warfer. Mrs. Andrew Warfer was in the living room, and a nice room it was, overlooking much of the farmland, the sea beyond, and the great cliffs, rising sheer from the yellow sands, playing hide-and-seek between them. The lady was portly, and sat in a chair made for comfort before the open window, and Guy, ushered into the presence of such homely dignity, wished to stammer an excuse and back out. Remembrance of the sprained foot alone restrained him. "You can stop here as long as you've a mind to, if only you behave yourselves," said the lady in the chair. "3 of us?" queried Guy. "The house is big enough," said the lady. Guy made a rush for the porch. "Come in, you beggars," said he. "There's a queen inside and a divinity in the kitchen." At the evening meal we were incorporated with the family. Mrs. Andrew Warfer, in her chair of comfort, presided, supported by her 2 tall sons, then us, then the farm servants, and the daughter of the house at the other end of the table. Our presence made no difference to the social economy of the farm, except that Mrs. Andrew Warfer presided over a late breakfast in the living room. This was quite a personal compliment, and never could woman look more comfortable than the widow Andrew Warfer at table. "If this is farm life, I'm a convert forever," said Guy, chipping an egg and catching the white cream in his spoon. The bread, just perfumed with the aroma of the burning furze with which the clome oven was heated, was delicious by itself. But with the butter thick upon it, the palate rose to the occasion and was satisfied. The home-cured ham in front of the comfortable window would take no denial, and must be tasted. The cream, with its sheen of gold, and the honey winking wickedly at the cream, would not be put aside. so there was nothing for it but to mix them both in holy matrimony upon the perfumed bed of bread. There was such a blend of delicate flavours and sightly delicacies that our eyes would shut, so that nothing might interfere with the joys of taste. Only a few flowers were on the table, but through the open window floated the scents of the garden, and the bees hummed and waltzed, and there was room for all, and to spare, at the table of the comfortable widow. "Great Scott!" said Guy. "I shall never forget such everything. Only the worst of it is, I shall never like anything again for evermore. Fancy shop eggs, and best Dorset, and allumed bread, and stale ham after this feast of the gods, when they lived among men. There's one saint still in Cornwall, the saint of good things at the shrine of the comfortable widow." We left the Bookworm to himself, and the odd volumes of the Arminian magazine, and such like, food for such as he, and he seemed as pleased as Punch at the thought of being alone with anything musty, fusty, and out of date. "Incurable," said Guy. "This reading habit sticks to a fellow of his sort, like dram drinking to a tramp." Guy was in the seventh heaven of delight when the daughter of the house told him that in an orchard, through which the brook ran to the sea, there were some trout. Her father used to bring home a fine posel sometimes, and his rod and lines were all in the house, for the boys never troubled to fish. So Guy went a-fishing, his heart full of content with his breakfast, and susceptible to the diviner impressions which the daughter of the house in blue print and white apron might make upon him. The boys called her Phil, but her name was Phyllis. He had got so far as that, when the widow's voice awoke him from contemplation of eyes and hair, and all the points which young men like to study at chance meetings. He found the brook, and then the orchard. The water was as bright as glass, and the sun motes danced upon it between the shadows. Trout there were in the stream, but they had not tasted a worm for a month except by chance, and the flies were not to their liking. Guy walked upstream to where the brook was fed by two trickling rills, where there was some depth of water, and an old overhanging bank, and current enough for his fly to sail downward, temptingly, to the eyes of adventurous trout, wanting to see life. At the deepest part, the stream was shadowed by a large apple tree, and here Guy changed his flies and cast deftly towards the spot where he felt sure the king of the stream must linger, if, indeed, it had a king. Presently a melodious splash above his own fly told its secret, and Guy's hopes rose until he caught a little beauty, and then another, and laid them on the grass, covering them with dock leaves with loving tenderness. Small fry that he would have been thankful for on other days, he returned to the stream with words of advice. Breakfast doesn't last forever, and Guy began to feel peckish, but he wasn't going to give up yet. Not he. He'd take home a fry of trout, which would send an incense above the farm to the blue heavens, and make all invisible spirits envious. Presently he heard dry branches breaking under a light footstep, and the daughter of the farm stood by him, a ministering angel with a pasty and a bottle of milk in a basket, covered with a cloth of purest white. This was what she used to do for her father, who wouldn't leave off until he had a dish to his liking, and mother, thinking all men who fished for trout were the same, sent her with the basket of croust, to keep off the pangs. So the dainty messenger, then Guy uncovered his spoil, and Phyllis played him artlessly, so that he, in his turn, rose and bolted the sweet bait, and turned to go downstream again, only to know that he was in the toils, unless the fair angler should let him go. She must go herself now, and Guy, who could not get away on his own account, felt grieved that release must come. It was sudden but irresistible, and the thrilling exquisite. Then came the shock. "I am bespoke already, sir." The line parted. Guy fished and fished until after sunset, but joy of capture was gone. He had himself been captured and felt pity. Still he brought home a fine basket, and the comfortable widow served them up for breakfast, whole and still beautiful. The bookworm, nursing his slight sprain, enjoyed himself in his own fashion, and rummaging at the back of the open bookcase, unearthed a book, bound in parchment, which commenced with farm accounts and ended with receipts and charms for the cure of man and beasts. The pages were undated, but were written 100 years ago by one Androwarfa, grandfather of the comfortable widow's husband. The document bore the following preface: "Lest I forget what has been told to me, I commit to paper charms and other devices for the cure of men and beasts. My forebears used these charms for more years than I can tell, and those who use them must have faith in them, that they will work their work, or they labour in vain, and I pray God that I commit no sin in handing down what I have been taught, but that it may be counted merit in me to preserve what has been found out with much labour, and have spared man and beast great and grievous sufferings in the flesh, and saved much money, when it could ill be spent, as, God wot, is the case on farms in this country. Mortal are we, and subject to diseases. We all must die, even when and how God pleases. Into the world but one way we do come, 1,000 ways from hence we are sent home." Some of the receipts would offend moderns, but all were seemingly set down in good faith, and the bookworm copied many with permission. "A tooth from a dead man's mouth, carried in the pocket, is an infallible charm against toothache. The 8th Psalm, read 3 times a day, 3 days running, cures the thrush. To keep away evil spirits from cattle, nail 4 horseshoes in the form of a cross against the door. A church key applied to a wound stops bleeding. Bore a hole in a nutmeg and tie round your neck, and nibble 9 mornings fastings, and boils will disappear in spring and autumn. Breathe over a newly made grave, and cure a cough. Take spoonful of earth from grave of newly interred virgin, dissolve in water, and drink fasting, to cure decline. Toad's liver fried is good for rheumatism, so also are adders' tails. The adders must be killed whilst dew is on them. The sign of the cross drawn on wood, stone, or metal, and bound over a wound, stops bleeding in man or beast." For toothache was this formula: "Upon a rock St. Peter stood towards Jerusalem, and Peter prayed, 'Lord, forgive me my sins, and I shall be free. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. Say 3 times a day, 3 days running, and drink powdered brimstone water between whiles. To cure toothache, sleep with key of church door around your neck. Water taken from church font is good for children with rickets, and will straighten bow-legged children, and children with wobbles. Black spiders dried and powdered cure heartburn." There were many other cures for heartburn, and all of them nasty, so nasty that spider powder sprinkled in water was dainty by comparison. "Meteorites and curious stones, when ground to powder, will cure men or beasts of all common diseases, and blue snake stones are infallible in case of snake bite. There were love philters innumerable, and it appeared that a deserted maid had only to steal her lover's jacket, turn the sleeves inside out, bury it at midnight in the churchyard, and then, presto, the lover's heart would turn and turn as the jacket rotted in the ground, until he came back repentant to his ancient flame." The bookworm made notes of many other things which would do for the curious in such matters, and remarked as singular that, in all the book, there was no reference to saints or invocations to saints, which, he said, was very strange in the land of saints. Guy confessed that the matter was beyond him, and said he did not care if he never heard the word saint again. Saint this and saint that and saint the other? There was too much of it in one small county to his taste. Chapter 19. Mrs. Androwarfa took kindly to the Bookworm. He was the lame duck of the party, and so she took a motherly interest in him and got him to talk about himself and his sleepless, restless nights, until he came into this land wherein nature was at rest, beautifying herself after passionate upheavals. And then she told him fairy stories about Piskies with half-shy credulity and sorrow in her face and voice that the old order had changed and given place to new. In her young days, a peddler with a big dog used to travel from farmhouse to farmhouse, and always got hospitality in exchange for news. At night, all the household crowded around the peddler to hear him fiddle and sing, and tell stories of the Piskies, and of men who listened to the songs of mermaids and disappeared from family and life. This peddler, Uncle Antony he was called, was a poet, and his Piskies were real as sunshine and shadow and the music of the birds. He knew them by name and talked to them, and met them by moonlight on the moors, and what Uncle Antony said was gospel truth. There was an old miller, living at an old mill not so very far away, who had the reputation of knowing more about Piskies than any man breathing. It was only a walking distance for the Bookworm, and Guy took his rod with him, having been told that below the mill he might cast a fly with some prospect of sport. Whipping a stream is something, and Guy said he'd rather cast at shadows than hang about a dusty old mill, listening to a foolish old man prating about foolish things. In fact, he was a little strong in his language, as he usually was when talking about people or things which did not interest him very much. The old Pisky man at the mill was, in fact, the Bookworm's find, which is quite enough, as a rule, to put Guy in opposition and incline him to use epigrammatic language touched with red. We reached the mill, the like of which is hardly to be found again within the four corners of the kingdom. It was a one-story building, and that so low that we had to be careful when inside not to knock our heads against the beams, and the machinery was as primitive as the process of grinding corn between revolving stones driven by water power. The ancient hopper was being slowly consumed by worms, and the bolting cloths hung limp and dusty, like the cloths sent home from Egyptian tombs. We first spied the miller looking through a ventilation hole, which served as a window. When we entered the mill, he was sitting on the lid of a thick oak chest, which had outlived the centuries and seemed quite capable of lasting forever. The miller was withered like the chest, and might have been believed if he said he was as old as the mill, only his eyes were bright and ferrety, as they took stock of us through the flour dust accumulated on his eyebrows and lashes. A sort of flour mummy outside of his grave clothes, out for an airing, he looked. The machinery was in motion when we entered, and a fine dust soon settled upon us, and then set us coughing and choking, so that we made a hasty retreat through the door, the top half of which was already open. The miller's cottage was a thatched dwelling, tacked onto the mill, which was also thatched, but nothing was visible of the cottage but windows, on account of the clustering roses and myrtles and fuchsias which clung to the old cob walls, and crept along the eaves and scrambled along the thatch. The old miller followed us out into the open and stopped the wheel by turning off the water, and then we noticed that the dripping wheel was festooned with lichen and was half hidden under the shadow of a huge flowering laurel. There were only 3 other cottages in the village, and these were all flower-laden, and now the clat, clat, clatter of the old wheel was stopped. The air was musical with the hum of insect symphonies, and then the perfume. We looked at one another and wondered. "Quiet like," said the old man, and that was all he had to say about this antique gem in a garden of myrtles and roses. Quiet like, indeed. Surely men may live in beauty until they cease to see it. We were out piskie hunting today, all except Guy, who already had his eye upon the stream which passed the old mill, then broadened where it could to be seen glistening in the sunshine. He wasn't long before he deserted us, and we were not sorry, being sure that if he once commenced questioning the miller in his off-hand manner, the old man would dry up quickly, and we should hear little. The bookworm took the old man's fancy by telling him about a new process for grinding flour between rollers so hard that they could only be cut by diamonds, and then with many windings got on the track of the Piskies. He took a lot of starting, it is true, but when once started, he covered a good deal of ground. He would take his own course, and a crooked one it was, but capable of being straightened out, which is more than can truly be said of the discourses of some very learned people. He was as sure and sartain that Piskies were real beings, and existed even now, as that water was wet, and he ought to know, because there was a Piskie which belonged to the old mill. There was some trouble one day at the mill about the non-delivery of grist, the miller being charged with taking unfair toll, and he shifted the responsibility onto his wife, who thereupon transferred the blame to the Piskie, as the person least likely to suffer in consequence. It so happened that the Piskie got to know of the slander, and he came to the mill in a great rage, and swore an oath binding in fairyland not to do another stroke of work in the old mill for 2 generations. "When I was a boy," said the old man, "I used to see the Piskies that belonged to the mill sitting on the stones when they were grinding, as comfortable as a fly would rest upon a turning wheel. And why not? When my father went to market and stopped away days, when there was no need, the work was done all the same. My father liked that very well, only the Piskie would give 2 good tummels when he filled the sacks, and when my father took too much toll, then he would tickle the palm of his hand and make it itch to remind him that he was cheating. When a miller is honest, a tuft of hair grows in the middle of his palm, but it didn't ever sprout in my father's, which made him poor-tempered sometimes. The Piskie was in the shape of a man, very dark, black-haired, cross-eyed. He could work best, the old folks said, when not seen, only his voice was large for his size, and made people know when he was about. He was the spirit of the mill, and belonged to it, so there was no question of payment, and the children grew knowing he was there, and were not afraid. Why should they be? When the Piskie said he would do no more work for 2 generations, my father stuck to work himself, which was better for him in the long run, and I've had to stick to it, and shall stick to it till I die, and then the Piskie will be free to come again." "And are there Piskies now?" "Why not?" "I don't know, but do people believe in them?" asked the bookworm. The old miller seemed to resent the question, and was so long in replying that we thought we had made a mess of it. It, however, appeared that he was only thinking, and at last he said, "For sartin, sure they do. You can't make butter if the Piskies turn the cream against the sun, and every dairy maid will tell ye so. If the Piskie up to Barton Farm has a spite against a new maid, he'll spoil her baking her bread. so that the bread will come out of the oven full of pisky spits, and he'll play her tricks until she's turned out of the house. When I was a boy, the Pisky used to have fine fun with the maidens up to Barton on winter nights when all the work was done. They used to blow out the candles and kiss the maids, and the maids would screech and find fault with the boys and scat their chacks for being too free in the dark. The Piskies were full of fun, and would whisper in a maid's ear when she was sleeping and tickle her nose to wake her when she had bad dreams. When the maids were courting, they'd lead 'em a pretty dance, and drive 'em to quarrel with their sweethearts, and then help 'em to make it up again. But the old man did not think they were as plentiful as they used to be, for the simple reason that people had learnt to do without them. What would be the good of piskies in the harvest field now, when everything was done by machinery, or in dairies, where butter was made in churns, or in flour mills, where corn was broken between rollers so hard that a diamond could only scratch them? The old man found it as hard to swallow the bookworm's description of roller mills as we found it to swallow his stories, and his were much more inviting. The ancient miller rambled on, telling us of tricks played upon his very own grandfather, who, returning from market with more brandy toddy under his belt than his weak head could carry, dared to cross a pisky ring on the moor without first turning his pockets inside out by way of homage. The poor man was pinched black and blue, was bound with bonds innumerable, no thicker than spiders' webs, and then, to tantalize him, his eyes were struck with magic unguent, and he was able to see the feasting and rioting going on all around him, without being able to enjoy the situation, all of which he did most steadfastly believe. "Below the Piskies," said Guy, rejoining us without warning. "Below the Piskies. Did you ever catch one, Master Miller?" A look of horror passed over the withered old face, which made it look uncanny. Catch a pisky, indeed! Had he been asked whether he'd ever robbed a church, he might have taken it less seriously. "Never mind," said Guy airily, seeing that he'd been guilty of something. "Never mind. If you never have, you still may. Specimens getting scarce, I suppose, and a bit expensive. Only you just pin one onto a card and send it to me registered, for safety, and I'll come down handsomely." The old man never recovered power of speech while we were with him, and he shook his hands with the bookworm and me automatically. We left him with eyes wide open, staring before him. I don't think he quite understood Guy's humour. The idea of catching a pisky and pinning it to a card, like small boys do cockchafers, came too suddenly upon him. Then to register a pisky and send it through the post office, deporting an ancient divinity under a postage stamp, set up ideas which wanted thinking out. I told Guy I feared the shock would be too much for the old man, but he only laughed and said, "Below the pisky, and look at my beauty." He had managed to catch a trout too small for anything, and he patted himself on the back and talked about it until he really believed he had done something deserving the world's gratitude. "After all," said the bookworm, when tired of listening to Guy and fly this or fly the other, "after all, there's no great difference between Guy and the miller. Guy's little trout has become a fairy already, and tomorrow will be even more wonderful than the miller's piskies. The mind's receptivity must— I know, I lost a great deal, and ought to be sorry for it, I dare say, but the word receptivity was too much, and I managed to escape that time." Chapter 20. There was a queer dried stick of a man at the farm, whom we never heard speak except to say, "Yes, maester," and "Zactly." His name was Jacob, and he was famous for having given a shrewd answer on one occasion when asked how he knew when he had had enough to eat. "When I do feel my buttons," said he. And people then said that Jacob was wiser than he looked, which was no doubt true, for he did not look very wise. The old boy had a trick of wandering about at nights, and was credited with having seen strange things which he was a nation sight too artful to talk about. After the evening meal, Mrs. Androwartha induced him to stay with us and tell us the story of something which happened at a neighbouring farm. Jacob was reared on the place, and so knew all about it. The widow translated as he went along, and the story ran like this. Jacob's Piskey story. A farmer, Nicholas Anea by name, was known far and wide as Old Hurry All. Every one about him was always glad to see his back turned, so as to have a bit of peace and quietness in the house. His wife was just the opposite, and took things easy, and when Nicky was going to drive to market in his cart, he nearly drove every one on the place mazed. 'Twas hurry, hurry, hurry all the time, and one day he was worse than ever and broke all the clome dishes in his tantrums. The poor woman threw her apron over her head and began to weep and sob so as to be heard a mile off. Now you must know there's a little man Piskey, which belonged to the missus's family, and came with her to her new home when she was married. He used to do odd jobs for her to make things go smooth, when Nicky was tazy-like, which was every day now, for he got worse with age. "What's the matter, missus?" asked the little man. "I wish I was dead," says missus. "That Nicky'll drive me as mad as Curly, and I'm only a shadder now." She weighed 10 score, but she thought she was failing. "I'll give him a lesson," says the little man. Now, what did the Piskey do? He hopped onto the cart by the side of Nicky, only Nicky couldn't see him, and he made a picture right before his very eyes, so that he saw the church tower standing in the market-place as large as life. And he drove, hurry, hurry all the time, and he'd scarce give himself time to speak a civil word to people as he passed along. He drove, and there was the church tower before him. The pigs in the cart squealed louder and louder as they got more and more famished, and the horse began to fail, and Nicky got madder and madder. Evening began to fall, and still the church tower was in front of him. And then night came, and the pigs were quiet through hunger, and the horse could scarcely put one leg before the other. And what did the little man do? Oh, he was artful. When the market was all over and night came, he removed the picture of the church tower in the marketplace from Nicky's eyes. And, lo and behold, the horse was standing, dead tired and ready to drop, outside of the very gate which it had been driven from in the morning. Nicholas Anea was a reformed man after that, and was no more in a hurry over things than his neighbours. But the story got about, of course, and the people have a saying now that a man in a hurry will be late to market. The early church seems to have had a great deal of trouble with Piskies, and every effort was made to put the people out of love with them. It was said that they were the souls of unbaptized infants and servants of old Artful, and for that reason they would neither enter a church nor come within sound of church bells. But Mrs. Androwartha told us of a legend which goes back further, namely, that Piskies are the children of Adam and Eve, who wouldn't be washed on Saturday nights before going to bed. Those who could get away did, to avoid having their ears filled with soap, and two hid away so effectually that they were never found again, although Adam and Eve sent the cry around, and then cried themselves until they were tired. These wandering children lived upon fern seed, mixed with dew flavoured with sunbeams, until they acquired the power of becoming invisible, and then they returned home and did household work and other things for the family. But they were like the famous soap that wouldn't wash. The old people used to tell children that they would be turned into Piskies if they wouldn't have their Saturday night tubbing and say their prayers and go to bed. There is a little brown moth called the Piskie, and children are now told that if they are not good, these Piskie moths will play them tricks in their sleep. The school boards have wrestled with the Piskie and failed, and now the county council is in the ring. Still the Piskie, visible and invisible, lives. The bookworm was on his legs again, and we all were sorry to leave the farm and the comfortable widow. Guy managed to linger behind and get a last word with Phyllis, the daughter of the house, and exchange photographs or perhaps something dearer to romance. The two tall sons walked with us a pure distance and told us the names of the farms round about, names which none but a native could ever remember. They told us that the Androwarfers had farmed this land from father to son for over 3 centuries. The eldest son was going to marry soon and bring home his wife, but would not dispossess his mother during her lifetime. Only the other son would go afield, Australia or Canada, and set up for himself. And Phyllis was to be married soon to a neighbouring farmer who would follow his own father by and by. Everything seemed so orderly as they talked, as though the currents of life flowed strong and deep, and the idea of home was never disturbed. The young people did not stay at home, dividing and subdividing lands and chattels until there was nothing to divide, but went abroad and set up new homesteads, calling them by the old names. Young Androwarfer said whether he settled in Canada or Australia, he'd call his farm after the old place. If he couldn't have anything else, he'd have the name to comfort him. Many of the young men did that, he said, when they settled in a new place. The bookworm said Cornwall was a bigger place than it looked, or than could be gripped between the arms of the Atlantic because of the tributaries it sent all over the world, every man taking with him a bit of Cornish earth and love, and setting up a new colony beyond the seas, just as the old Greeks carried with them some of the fire from the ancient hearths. Guy said he would remember the name of the farm for the rest of his life, and he tramped along with laggard steps, and would have given much for an excuse to run back and find a dropped handkerchief, and shake hands over again with the comfortable widow, on the chance of seeing Phyllis, the bespoke. When we got off the estate and the young men left us, he wanted to know whether it would be possible to fancy the dainty Phyllis as comfortable in days to come as her portly mother. We turned round just to take a last look at the farmhouse wherein we had been so well treated. The dwelling and all the outhouses made a goodly show, and at a distance the yellow lichen, a poor poverty-looking thing enough, covering the roofs, had the appearance of burnished gold. Nature here will insist on dressing herself out in most unlikely places, and has a trick of her own for covering up ugliness. A flash of sunshine, a breath of air, a pinch of dust kissed with dew, and flat slates on ugly roofs are covered with cloth of gold for the tired feet of winged spirits of the air. This was the last view that 3 tramps had, and the remembrance remains with them. A Cornishman seldom travels without a pasty. When small, a pasty is a snack. When large, it's a meal. Mrs. Androwarfer gave each of us a pasty to keep us from fainting by the way, just the same as a considerate hostess elsewhere would slip a packet of dainty sandwiches into the hands of departing guests. "You'll find 'em good," she said with honest pride, and we did. The home of the pasty is Cornwall. It may be met with in Devon and is possible in Yorkshire, but Cornwall is its home now. In a sense, the pasty is Cornish. There are other dishes, but the pasty comes first, the making of which is handed down from generation to generation. Every created thing that may be eaten goes into a pasty: fish, flesh or fowl, and the herb of the field, whether sweet or sour, to say nothing of fruits and humble potatoes and turnips. When a woman has a rage for pasty making, nothing comes amiss when the strip of dough is ready. There's a knack in turning out a shapely pasty, no longer than one's hand, or big enough for a family to carve at and come again. All pasties are alike on the outside, and the cable twist running from end to end, delicately tapering from the centre towards the points, is a work of art to look at. As the pasty goes to the oven, so it comes out, puffed up a little with self-conscious pride at having gone through the fiery trial, and come out a generous brown, with every cable twist intact and every curve swelling with inward importance. The origin of the pasty is lost with the language, but the thing is universal and the friend of all. The workman takes it in his bag, the traveller pops it in his pocket. The family sit around it. No knife, no fork, no tablecloth is wanted. Out comes the pasty, and the feast begins. A pasty fresh from the oven sends up an incense which makes a hungry man thankful to be alive. A man will call at a friend's house with his pasty in his pocket, and the good woman will warm it for him, and he'll join the family circle without anyone thinking it an intrusion. Tea is the drink with a pasty. Anything else will do, from white wine to cider, but tea is the drink for choice. A pie is another Cornish dish and lends itself to the racial aptitude for secrecy. Almost anything under the sun may be put into a pie, and no one be the wiser, for the crust puts on a brave face and hides the poverty, should there be poverty, underneath. No end of stories have been told of pies. A person in a sarcastic mood has been known to send a neighbour a pie with a halter in it. But the Piskies did something better than that, and sent the barren wife of the Earl of Cornwall a pie, which, when opened, was filled with sweet herbs and wild flowers, in the midst of which a little heir lay smiling. And then, as a set-off, old Nick comes in and watches a woman make an all sorts pie, in which nothing seemed out of place, and so afraid was he that his own dear self would be included that he skipped out of the county. The pie, like the pasty, is a mystery until it is opened, unless the crust is decorated with the foot of a duck or some other indication of contents. The heads of pilchards peeping through the crust suggested the name of Stargazy pie, but a stranger in the land may never see it. Indeed, he may never see many things. Chapter 21. Through August and down to the middle of September is the season for blackberries, and wherever the bramble can grow, there the black, luscious fruit hangs ripe and tempting. The bookworm hazarded the guess, as we tramped along, that the plant followed the Celtic immigration in Cornwall and Brittany. The Bretons make money of the fruit, but here whoever is minded may pick and eat and carry away, and no one was ever prosecuted for wandering over fields in search of the fruit, and pulling down bits of hedges to secure it. During the season, blackberry parties go out with crook sticks and baskets and faces as clean as usual, and return tired and torn, with hands and lips and faces dyed all over with the dark juice. Some say it was the blackberry juice which the ancient inhabitants used for frightening away the Roman legions, but nothing positive is now known. It is, however, the fact that the Cornish die just as much of themselves as is visible with blackberry juice once a year. And this may be a survival of an ancient custom. Just for a wonder, it was neither Saint nor Piskey who was quoted in connection with blackberries, but old Nick himself, who ate so many one 13th of September that he felt real ill, and he cursed the fruit with such a terrible curse that after the fatal 13th, the fruit is said to be unfit for food and is allowed to rot where it grows. If the blackberry isn't a native, it ought to be, considering the impudent way in which it takes possession of the hedges and fences, scrambling over everything, and sucking in all the sunshine which comes out of the sky. Anywhere, everywhere, it grows, even along the bleak sea cliffs, watched with sea spray and ruffled with bitter winds. But the fruit is most sweet and generous when growing in sheltered spots on moor and in valley. We were told to be sure to have blackberry pie, and we had it at the farm, and if the immortals didn't envy us when eating blackberry pie, smothered with Mrs. Androwarthy's cream, it's proof positive that they don't know about one good thing in the eating line. The Wesleyans are especially fond of blackberries. Of course, there's a reason for it. The Bookworm stumbled on it as usual, and we went to the circuit minister, who said he was quite right, and it was the fruit which kept John Wesley alive on St. Hilary Downs. The story is all right, and it can be verified in print. Here it is. One day we had been preaching on St. Hilary Down. As we returned, John Wesley stopped his horse to pick the blackberries, saying, "Brother Nelson, we ought to be thankful that there are plenty of blackberries, for this is the best county I ever saw for getting a stomach, and the worst I ever saw for getting food." Guy said there ought to be a blackberry day as well as a primrose day. Why not? White roses and orchids are consecrated to other illustrious persons. Why not blackberries to John Wesley? Of course, the blackberry has its legend, and this is one as it was told to us. The romance of Princess Olwen. The fairest princess in Cornwall, as everyone knew, was the daughter of Bran Dew. And it was the surprise of every one that his daughter should be so fair when he was so dark. And it was the surprise of every one that his daughter should be so fair when he was so dark. Dark as his own black heart, and that was dark enough, in all conscience. More golden was her hair than the flower of the firs, and her skin was whiter than the foam of the wave. A twin sister she had who favoured their father, and she was as dark as a thundercloud and as passionate as the other was gentle. The twins grew up and got on very well together, until the son of the king stopped at Bran Dew's castle and received a cup of milk from the hand of the fair princess, who was called Olwen, when he ought to have received it from Gerfa, she of the flashing eyes and heart of fire. Bran Dew had made other arrangements for his fair daughter, whom he removed the very next day to the dwelling of a herdsman, whose wife was a witch, and who had strict orders not to let the young prince see the fair princess, even if he should chance upon her whereabouts. It wasn't long before the young prince came again, and this time Gerfa handed him a cup of milk, but he had no eyes for her, and rode away. Whenever he came, he only saw Gerfa, and rode away disappointed, which so wounded her vanity that she ended by hating her sister of the yellow hair and sea-foam skin. The young prince went to his father, who commanded Bran Dew to come and see him, bringing the fair Olwen with him. Now Bran Dew was a subtle man, and told lies as naturally as other great people, and he said that Olwen went on a visit in the country and died, and was buried by the old herdsman and his wife. He didn't mind telling where Olwen really was, because the herd's wife had orders to turn the fair young princess into a bramble whenever the king or young prince came in search of her. The young prince was very much in love, and rode off to the herd's house. And the herd's wife showed him the clothes which Olwen had worn, and the mound covering her, and the bramble thick with blossom festooning the hedge. He was so sorrowful that he did not notice that the bloom was out of season. He came again and talked to the herd's wife, for his heart was sore, and there was always the bramble in full bloom. Now, at the king's court there was a wise man who smelt a rat as soon as ever he heard about the bramble being in bloom, in season and out of season, whenever the prince happened to be there. So he turned the young prince into a chough, and told him to fly over to the herdsman's house and look around. The Cornish chough was common enough in those days, and the old witch took no notice of the black bird with red beak hopping about the garden, its head on one side and one eye on Olwen the fair. The wise man, when he knew that Olwen was really in the flesh, took in the whole situation. The young prince flew over to the herdsman's house and hopped around and followed his lady love until she got into a wood, when he resumed his proper shape and told his love, sweet and strong, and stayed so late that the old witch caught him at it, and told Bran Dew, who became as mad as a hatter, and told Gerfer, who became madder than he. And they went over to the herdsman's and ordered the witch to turn Olwen into a bramble, and pour some magic drops upon her fair blooms, so that she should become green and red and black in turns, sour to the taste and ugly to look upon. Then the wise man anointed the beak of the chough, saying, "Fly away and kiss the bloom, and your love shall become sweet and more sweet. And when the berry is sweetest to your taste, pluck it and bring it to me." And so he did. Then the wise man broke the spell, and prince and princess were married. But the bramble flourished and spread everywhere, and all the people marvelled when they ate of it or turned it into wine, as they do to this day. And all true lovers know that sweetest is the love which has been hard to get, and has passed through its sour and bitter stages, and is plucked when ripest. We saw a Cornish chough during our tramp, but it is getting scarce now, and tens of thousands of people may come and go without ever seeing one. When the bird with vermeil-tinted legs and bright red beak has quite vanished from its old haunts, it will probably be held in the highest esteem, like it once was when it lived in the odour of sanctity. The chough was at one time a sacred bird in Cornwall, just as the long-legged ibis on the banks of the Nile, and, according to the story, had secret relations with Old Nick, just as its cousin the raven had in Wales. An odour of sulphur may have been the consequence, but as even birds may reform, the chough cut its old acquaintance, and was selected as the future habitation for the spirit of King Arthur. When a Cornishman sees a chough, he raises his hat, if he has one, or pulls his forelock if he hasn't, which means the same thing, namely, that the chough is of sainted lineage, and worthy of the very highest respect. It is not so easy to see a chough now outside of a collection. The chough is of very aristocratic appearance, and, in consequence, All poor and ragamuffin and envious relations of the Crow tribe are doing their best to get rid of him by any means. No doubt dynamite would be used if the Crow socialists knew how to handle it. It was an unfortunate day for the chuff when Shakespeare advertised it as the russet-pated chuff. And that might not have been so very bad, only it set some people saying that Shakespeare did not know what he was talking about, which provoked others to reply, and so the newspapers debated whether Shakespeare should be criticised. Then all Cornwall was ransacked for chuffs to see whether he was russet-pated. If pate means head, then he isn't. But if pate means foot, then he is russet-pated or footed. Those who held that the poet knew what he was writing about scored one, but the discussion cost the chuff dear, so many people finding it necessary to shoot every chuff they saw. Every year King Arthur visits his own tomb in the form of a chuff, and some people hope that one chuff will be allowed to live in the land just so long as the old king likes to revisit his own grave and attend to its weeding. It should be a pity for an old tradition to die out, for want of a bird to carry it on.